The November air bit through my coat as I climbed the steps to my parents' house clutching a pumpkin pie I'd baked from scratch. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg should have felt comforting, but my stomach twisted with unease. 2 years had passed since I'd last crossed this porch, 2 years since I'd spoken to my father after walking away from everything the Carter name stood for. The house looked exactly the same, wreath on the door, golden light spilling from the windows, but something about it felt colder, sharper, like the house itself was waiting to judge me. I adjusted my scarf, took a breath, and knocked. For a moment, nothing. Then the heavy door swung open, and there he was. Richard Carter, my father. The man everyone in our Vermont town called Honorable Steady a Pillar. His face was carved from granite. He didn't say a word. His hand shot out so fast I didn't even register it until I felt the sting explode across my cheek. The sound echoed against the porch boards, small but brutal. The pie box slipped from my hands, splattering orange filling across the step. "You don't belong here, Emily," he said, his voice low but full of rage. "You're not part of this family anymore." My throat closed around a dozen words that wouldn't come. Behind him, I saw my mother standing in the foyer, her hands twisting the hem of her pearl sweater, eyes wide and glistening. My brother Evan was there too, his police uniform crisp, his posture rigid, a ghost of our father's authority reflected in him. Beside him, his wife Monica folded her arms, the corner of her mouth curving into something almost like satisfaction. I opened my mouth, managed a whisper. "Dad, I came home. You said—" His voice cut through mine. I said nothing. "You weren't invited. Leave." The cold hit harder than before. My face burned, but the shame went deeper, curling through my chest until I could barely breathe. I looked to my mother. "Mom!" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked down. That silence hurt more than the slap. Inside, laughter from the dining room faltered. Someone whispered. I saw the flicker of movement, neighbors' relatives' faces I'd known since childhood, now avoiding my gaze as if I were something contagious. I took a step back, my heel crushing the ruined pie box. The smell of it mixed with the faint scent of turkey and pine from the house. For a second, I remembered Thanksgiving mornings when Dad used to lift me up to hang the wreath when Mom would hum while basting the turkey, when Evan and I would sneak bites of stuffing and get scolded all laughter and warmth. That memory felt like a lie now. I steadied my voice. "Why, what did I do that was so unforgivable?" My father's eyes narrowed. "You know exactly what you did." He turned away as if I were no more than a stranger at his door. "Go back to whatever life you chose. You made your bed." The door began to close. I heard Monica murmur something I couldn't catch and Evan's quiet chuckle, low and bitter. I stood frozen until the latch clicked, sealing me out. Snowflakes drifted onto my hair, melting against the heat of my skin. I touched my cheek, still throbbing from the slap, and stared at the door that used to open for me without knocking. The truth was, I didn't even know what hurt more, the sting of his hand or the finality in his eyes. The house that had once been my world now looked like a fortress, and I was the enemy outside its gates. I stood there for what felt like forever, snow gathering on my coat, the last of the daylight fading behind the pines. My father's voice still rang in my head, sharp and absolute, cutting deeper than the slap itself. "You don't belong here!" The words burned through me, louder than the hum of cars in the distance, louder than the hollow echo of laughter leaking through the door he'd just slammed in my face. I picked up the ruined pie box now, a soggy mess of pumpkin and crushed crust, and placed it gently on the porch rail. It looked pitiful, like an offering rejected by the gods. My fingers trembled, but not from the cold. Somewhere inside that house, my family was sitting down to dinner, passing around dishes, pretending I didn't exist. I stepped off the porch, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. For a long moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk, staring up at the windows glowing gold against the early dusk. I could see shapes moving, my brother's shadow crossing the dining room, my mother's silhouette near the table. Once that table had been my safe place. Now it was the symbol of everything I'd lost. My throat tightened. I didn't cry. I couldn't. Instead, I spoke softly, mostly to myself, but also to the invisible audience I somehow knew was listening somewhere out there in the world. Before I tell you what happened after that slap, tell me where you're watching from, I said, my voice trembling but steady enough to hold. Tell me if you've ever been shut out by your own family, because that's what this is about. Not just the slap, not just Thanksgiving, but the moment you realize blood isn't love. I took a deep breath, tasting the iron of cold air and humiliation. The smell of roasted turkey drifted out when someone opened the door inside, followed by laughter, sharp, mocking familiar. I turned away. The street was quiet except for the faint chime of church bells marking the hour. Each toll felt like a countdown to something I couldn't yet name. My hands were still shaking when I whispered, "This is where it began, but it's not where it ends." Then I walked into the snow away from the light and toward the truth that had been waiting for years to break free. When I was little, people used to say our family looked like something out of a Thanksgiving postcard, Dad in his sheriff's uniform, Mom with her pearls, Evan and me smiling on the courthouse steps. But behind those smiles was the constant pressure to perform, to be perfect, to never embarrass the Carter name. My father, Richard Carter, had built his entire identity around control. He believed in discipline, reputation, and silence. He ruled our house like he ruled his precinct, with fear disguised as order. My mother, Linda, floated behind him like a shadow. Her voice was always soft, her movements careful, her eyes full of calculation. She never disagreed with him in public. In private, she'd just whisper, "You know how your father gets when he's stressed." Evan absorbed everything Dad said as gospel. He was born to be the heir, the next generation of the Carter image. Straight A's football captain, police academy graduate, he wore obedience like armor. I was the opposite. I loved numbers, but not the kind that came with badges or weapons. I wanted to understand people, businesses, the invisible math that shaped choices. I studied accounting at UVM and took a job at a small community nonprofit that tracked grants for veterans. I thought Dad would be proud that I wanted to serve too, just in my own way. Instead, he sneered, "You're wasting your potential balancing receipts for broken men." He never forgave me for leaving the path he'd chosen. Thanksgiving used to be the one time we pretended to be a normal family. Even when Dad's temper boiled under the surface, Mom would overcompensate with perfect table settings and overcooked turkey. I'd bring homemade pies. Evan would bring department gossip, and Dad would hold court with his usual booming laugh. But 2 years ago, that changed. I'd been auditing local donations for the Veterans Relief Fund when I found something that didn't add up: large withdrawals signed off by my father's department funneled into a private account labeled Community Development. The transactions were old, hidden under layers of legitimate transfers. When I looked closer, I saw the name E. Carter listed as secondary authorizer. My stomach dropped. I remember printing those pages with shaking hands, hoping I was wrong. I wasn't. That night, I drove home with the documents tucked in my coat pocket, my heart pounding. I wanted to believe there was some mistake, that maybe it was paperwork oversight. But when I showed Dad the printouts, he didn't even look surprised. He tore them in half, threw them into the fireplace, and said, "In this family, we protect our own. You don't dig where you shouldn't." His voice was cold, absolute, and final. Mom stood behind him, her face pale, whispering, "Please, Emily, don't ruin your father's career." Evan's jaw tightened. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. In that moment, I understood something I had never wanted to admit in our house truth was treason. The next morning, my access to the fund records was revoked. A week later, I lost my job at the nonprofit. Budget restructuring, they said, but I saw the police department's signature on the notice. The message was clear: Dad still pulled the strings. For months, I tried to move on, working odd freelance jobs, keeping my distance, but the guilt never faded. Someone had to be accountable for the money that never reached the veterans who needed it. Someone had to speak up, and yet when I called the state auditor's office, the files I'd submitted were missing. Every trace of my report had vanished. That was when I realized my father's reach went farther than I'd ever imagined. He wasn't just corrupt, he was protected. I left town that night, packed my car, and drove north until the lights of Vermont blurred behind me. I promised myself I'd never go back. But then 2 weeks ago, my mother called. Her voice was softer than I remembered. "Your father isn't well," she said. "He wants to make peace." Thanksgiving will be small, just family. I almost believed her. I told myself maybe time had softened him, maybe truth had found a way to heal. I should have known better. When Richard Carter asked for peace, what he really wanted was obedience. The night my father burned those papers was the night something inside me changed. I had always believed that truth, no matter how painful, was a form of loyalty, that if I loved my family enough, I could fix what was broken. But standing there in the flicker of the fire, watching evidence curl into ash, I realized that in our house, loyalty meant silence. After that, things began to unravel. My mother's tone cooled into politeness. My brother stopped answering my calls. In town, people I'd known for years crossed the street when they saw me coming. Rumors spread that I'd tried to sabotage my father's department to get back at him for not funding my little nonprofit. I didn't recognize my life anymore. Every job interview ended with polite smiles and no offers. Every friend suddenly became too busy. The Carters were respected. I was radioactive. I moved into a small apartment in Burlington, worked remotely, and avoided Thanksgiving, Christmas, all of it. But I couldn't stop thinking about those missing funds. Where had the money gone? What had Dad and Evan done with it? One night, unable to sleep, I opened an old drive I'd kept from my nonprofit days. I had backed up some data for safety before my access was revoked, a habit drilled into me by years of auditing. My fingers hovered over the folder marked Archives 2019. Inside, hundreds of files appeared: ledgers, invoices, internal memos. Buried among them was a PDF labeled Community Development Allocation Restricted. I clicked. My father's signature stared back at me alongside the name Evan Carter, Assistant Authorizer. The transfers had continued for years, small amounts spread across multiple accounts, all feeding into one final destination, a private shell corporation registered in New Hampshire under Carter Community Holdings. My hands went cold. The shell account wasn't just illegal, it was deliberate. A machine built to move public funds quietly into personal investments. I scrolled faster, my heart pounding. There were deposits from construction contractors, police union donations, even checks from local developers. The Carter name was everywhere. I printed copies, hid them inside an envelope, and locked it in a safe behind my bookshelf. That was 2 years ago. I tried to forget, to convince myself someone else would uncover it, that justice didn't need me. But silence doesn't bury truth, it incubates it. When Mom called 2 weeks ago asking me to come home, I hesitated. "Your father's health isn't good," she'd said. "He wants to see you." Her voice cracked just enough for me to believe her. "Please, Emily, it's time." I'd stared at the envelope on my shelf that night, fingers tracing the edge. A voice inside whispered, "Maybe forgiveness is the only way forward." I didn't know it then, but the invitation wasn't forgiveness, it was a trap. They didn't want peace. They wanted control. They wanted to make sure I never spoke again. The next morning, I packed the envelope in my bag. I told myself I wouldn't use it. It was just insurance. But deep down, I think I knew what was coming. There was one final line in the last email I'd sent to my mother before Thanksgiving, the night before I drove home. "If there's something I should know, tell me now." She never replied. Instead, I arrived to a front door, a slap and a sentence that tore the last thread between us: "You don't belong here." And in that instant, I finally understood maybe I never had. When Mom called to invite me home, I wanted to believe her. Her voice had sounded softer than it had in years, almost trembling, when she said, "Your father isn't the man he used to be. He wants peace before it's too late." I told myself that people change, that age makes them gentler, that maybe I'd misjudged him. But even as I packed my bag, I felt that old knot of dread forming in my stomach. I baked a pumpkin pie the way she used to like it, with extra cinnamon, and toasted pecans, trying to fill my apartment with the smell of something warm, something normal. On Thanksgiving morning, I ironed a dress I hadn't worn in years, pulled my hair back like Mom preferred, and drove through quiet back roads lined with bare maples and falling light snow. I wanted to look like the daughter she could be proud of. But the second I turned down our old street, unease prickled across my skin. There were too many cars. Not just family black sedans and SUV I didn't recognize, even the silver Lexus that belonged to Judge Harlan, one of Dad's old drinking buddies. The house looked staged, like a set built to prove something. Every window glowed, every curtain perfectly aligned. When I parked at the curb, I sat for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel, watching silhouettes move behind the dining room window. My brother's tall frame, Mom's hair pinned up just so, and then, briefly, a man in a suit with a file folder under his arm. I frowned. Thanksgiving had never included strangers. I stepped out of the car, clutching the pie, and walked up the stone path slick with frost. As I reached the steps, the front door cracked open and Monica appeared holding a wine glass. Her lipstick was perfect, her smile even more so. "Emily," she said, sounding surprised and bored at the same time. "You actually came." "Mom invited me," I said carefully. "Is everything okay?" Monica's smile didn't move. "Everything's fine. Just a little family business to finish before dinner." Her eyes flicked toward the study where voices murmured behind closed doors. "You'll see." She turned away before I could answer. That was when I noticed the stack of papers on the hallway console, clipped neatly with my name visible in bold on the top page. Property transfer agreement. My pulse stumbled. It was the family home, the land, everything my grandparents had left behind. I heard my father's voice through the study door, steady, commanding the same tone he used in interrogation rooms. "Let's finalize this before she arrives. I don't want her making a scene." The realization hit hard and fast. I wasn't being invited home for peace. I was being summoned to sign something, to make my erasure official. When the door finally opened and Dad appeared, his expression didn't soften. He looked at me like a problem that needed managing. "You shouldn't have come early," he said. "We weren't ready yet." That's when the slap came, quick, rehearsed, inevitable. In that instant, I knew he hadn't called me home to make peace. He'd called me home to silence me. The sound of that slap still rang in my ears as I stumbled back, one hand pressed to my face. For a moment, the world went quiet, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Then, like a curtain lifting the laughter from inside, dimmed, replaced by the heavy hush of 100 eyes turning my way. From the doorway behind my father, I could see the long dining table gleaming under chandelier light. The good china laid out the silver, polished to perfection. Every seat was filled. My mother at the far end, Evan beside her, Monica sitting too close to him, and in the middle of it all, the judge, the man whose Lexus I'd seen outside, leaning back with his glass of bourbon. When our eyes met, he smiled a slow, knowing smile like he was watching a show he'd already seen the ending to. I realized then that this wasn't just a family dinner. It was a performance, and I was the villain in their script. "Richard," my mother whispered sharply, rising halfway from her chair, "please." But Dad lifted a hand and she froze. Not another word. He turned back to me, his voice low enough to keep its calm high enough for everyone to hear. "You don't belong here, Emily. You made your choices. You brought shame to this family. You can leave the same way you left before, quietly." I stared at him, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Shame." My voice cracked. "For what?" "For doing the right thing." Evan stood, then his expression perfectly blank like a cop responding to a disturbance. "You need to go," he said, his hand resting on the back of Monica's chair. "Dad's right. You've caused enough problems." Monica smirked. Some people just can't let go of the past. Her words hit harder than the slap. I looked around at the table at faces that once felt like home, now turned toward me with polite disgust. People I'd babysat for old neighbors, even 2 men from the town council, all pretending this was normal, that throwing out a daughter on Thanksgiving was simply the natural consequence of disobedience. I opened my mouth to speak, but my father's tone dropped to something cold and final. "You think you can come back here after everything you've done, after betraying your own blood?" "I didn't betray anyone," I said quietly. "You did." Something flickered in his eyes, fear maybe, but it vanished as quickly as it came. He stepped closer until I could smell the bourbon on his breath. "You want to talk about betrayal? Let's talk about how you stole files from your job and tried to frame your own family. How you cost this town its reputation. How you humiliated me." I shook my head. "That's not true, and you know it." He ignored me, turning toward the crowd behind him like a preacher delivering his sermon. "You see what happens when someone forgets loyalty. When family stops being sacred." The judge raised his glass. "To loyalty," he said smoothly, and a few people actually clinked glasses in response. Something in me cracked open, then rage, grief, maybe both. I felt my voice rise, trembling but strong. You can twist the story all you want, but I know the truth. And so do you. You took what didn't belong to you. You hurt people who trusted you. And now you're trying to make me pay for it. A murmur rippled through the room. Dad's face went pale with anger. "Get out," he said through clenched teeth. I looked at Mom one last time. Her lips trembled, but she didn't move. She just lowered her gaze to her untouched plate. That silence sealed it. I turned, picked up my coat, and walked to the door. Behind me, I heard Monica's voice, a soft hiss meant to reach my ears. "Maybe next year you'll stay gone for good." I didn't answer. As I stepped back into the freezing night, the sound of laughter started again inside, forced, hollow, desperate. It was the laughter of people pretending they hadn't just destroyed their own daughter to keep their world intact. I walked down the driveway with my head high and my heart hammering against my ribs, determined not to let them see the way my body shook. The cold bit at my face where his hand had landed each gust of wind, a reminder of what had just happened. My car sat under the flickering streetlight like a lifeline waiting. I slid inside, slammed the door, and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Through the windshield, I could still see the glow from the house, the silhouettes moving around the table, the faint blur of my mother's figure near the window. She looked out once, maybe at me, maybe past me, then turned away. I started the engine. The radio came on mid-song, something cheerful and unbearably wrong. I switched it off and sat in silence. My breathing was uneven, my throat thick with words I couldn't say. The pie lay ruined on the passenger seat, the box torn and leaking orange filling like blood. I thought about getting out, throwing it against the door, screaming until someone heard, but that would give them exactly what they wanted, proof that I was the problem. So instead, I drove. The road curved through the dark countryside snow, falling harder now, the tires crunching over ice. Every few miles, my father's words echoed in my head like a mantra turned curse. "You don't belong here." The phrase had lived in my life for years, whispered in smaller ways when I questioned, when I resisted, when I refused to play the good daughter. Tonight, he just said it out loud. My vision blurred, and I blinked hard, refusing to cry. I didn't even know where I was going until I realized I'd pulled over near the old bridge outside town, the one overlooking the frozen river. I parked and cut the engine. The world went quiet again. That was when I remembered Sam Rodriguez. It had been months since I'd last spoken to him, maybe a year. He'd been one of the only people at the state auditor's office who believed me back then, who said, "If you ever find real evidence, don't sit on it, Emily. Call me." I'd kept his number in my phone, buried under SR, like a secret I wasn't ready to use. My hands trembled as I unlocked my phone. For a moment, I hesitated. Calling him meant reopening everything I'd tried to bury: the investigation, the town, my family's lies. But what was left to protect anymore? They'd already erased me. I found his name, pressed dial, and listened to the ring echo through the quiet car. He answered on the third ring, his voice steady, familiar. "Emily, it's been a while. You okay?" I laughed, a sound that cracked on the way out. "Not really," I said. "You remember those files I told you about, the ones I shouldn't have kept?" He went silent for a beat. "Yeah." "What about them?" I looked out at the snow swirling over the river. My reflection fractured in the windshield. "I think it's time I finally used them." Sam didn't waste time on pleasantries. The next morning, when I arrived at the Burlington State office, he was already waiting in the lobby coat, half on coffee, untouched. His expression said everything he'd seen enough corruption in his career to recognize when someone was drowning in it. "You brought them?" he asked quietly as we walked to his office. I nodded, pulling the small flash drive from my pocket. My fingers hesitated before handing it over. "It's all here," I said. "Transfers, authorizations, sign-offs, even the Shell account. They used the Veterans Fund to launder money for development contracts." He closed the blinds before plugging it in. The hum of the computer filled the room. I watched his face shift as lines of data appeared, dates, account numbers, signatures that I knew too well. My father's name sat beside my brother's on almost every transaction. Sam leaned back slowly. "Emily, this isn't petty theft. This is systemic. We're talking about embezzlement, fraud, bribery, maybe even racketeering." My throat felt dry. "Can you prove it?" He looked at me. "You just did." He printed several pages, marking them with a pen as he spoke. "Some of these contractors look." He pointed to one name circled in red. "Harlan Construction. That's Judge Harlan's family business." The same man who'd smiled at me across the Thanksgiving table. My stomach turned. Sam kept reading. "And here, payments from the police union funneled into private development projects. Your father must have built an entire network." I stared at the documents, and my brother Sam hesitated. "He signed off on at least half of these. Looks like he helped cover the movement between accounts. They trusted him because of his badge." The air felt heavy. I pressed my palms to the desk, fighting the wave of nausea creeping up my throat. "So what happens now?" He sighed. "Now we report it to the State Financial Crimes Unit. They'll open a full investigation, subpoena bank records, start interviews. But Emily, once we do this, there's no turning back." I met his eyes. "They've already taken everything from me. What's left to lose?" He nodded and began encrypting the files for transfer. While he worked, I glanced out the window. Snow drifted past the glass in slow spirals. For the first time since yesterday, the cold outside didn't seem as sharp as the chill that had lived inside me for years. When Sam finally hit send, the system pinged confirmation. "It's done," he said softly. The weight of it settled between us. I should have felt relief, but what I felt was fear. Fear of what came next, fear of my father's rage, fear of what justice would actually cost. Sam seemed to read my thoughts. "They'll fight back. They always do. But this time you're not alone." I nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed him. As I drove home that evening, the world looked the same. Snow-quiet streets, Christmas lights flickering in windows, but everything had changed. I'd just lit a match to the Carter legacy, and the fire was coming. The first sign that the investigation had begun came 3 days later. A news alert flashed across my phone. State launches probe into Vermont Veterans Fund mismanagement. They didn't name my father yet, but the article quoted a high-ranking law enforcement source and mentioned discrepancies linked to several town contracts. My hands trembled as I scrolled. The names of those contractors, Harlan Construction North River Development, were the same ones I'd seen in the files. My father's empire was cracking. By the end of the week, reporters were outside his office. The police station where he'd once been untouchable now buzzed with whispers. I watched from a distance, parked across the street in my car, as he pushed through a swarm of microphones, jaw-tight, eyes wild. No comment, he barked. The town split in two overnight. Half believed he'd been framed by his bitter daughter, who couldn't handle discipline. The other half whispered that they'd always suspected something dark beneath the Carter shine. My name surfaced online. Someone leaked it, probably from inside the department. The comments were brutal. "Ungrateful brat. Attention seeker. You don't turn on your own blood." I stopped reading after that. One evening, Sam called. "They've frozen the fund accounts," he said. "Your father's under review, and your brother's been placed on administrative leave. It's moving faster than I expected." I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt the strangest mix of sorrow and anticipation, like standing on a cliff watching the tide rise, knowing it would reach me too. The next morning, someone left an envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a single note written in my father's handwriting. "You'll destroy your mother. You'll regret this." No signature, no address, just that. I folded it carefully and slipped it into a folder labeled Evidence. 2 days later, my phone buzzed again, Sam's voice urgent. "They're raiding the Carter residence. Stay put." But I couldn't. I needed to see it. When I reached the house, flashing lights painted the snow red and blue. Officers carried out boxes of documents, computers, even framed certificates that once hung proudly in Dad's office. My mother stood on the porch wrapped in her robe, crying quietly while neighbors whispered from behind curtains. Evan tried to push past the officers, shouting that this was a misunderstanding, that they were ruining a good man's name. One reporter caught the moment he swung at a cameraman. The clip hit the news that night, and by morning the whole state had seen it. That was the moment the Carter image shattered. Later that day, I got a call from an unknown number. My father's voice came through hoarse and furious. "You think this is justice? You've destroyed us, Emily. You've turned the town against its own." I gripped the phone. "You destroyed yourself, Dad. I just stopped covering for you. He was silent for a long beat. When he spoke again, his voice was low and trembling. "You'll pay for this, one way or another." Then the line went dead. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my apartment surrounded by printouts and copies of files, staring at everything I had uncovered. For the first time, I didn't feel like the scared daughter who'd once begged for her father's approval. I felt something new, resolve. The next morning, the story broke nationally. Vermont police chief and son under federal investigation for fraud and embezzlement. Their mugshots appeared side by side on my screen faces I'd known all my life, now marked by defeat. The reporter's voiceover said they were accused of siphoning over $2 million in public funds. I waited for relief, but it didn't come. Justice wasn't triumph. It was heavy, complicated, and lonely. That evening, as snow fell softly outside, there was a knock on my door. I hesitated, half expecting another threat, but when I opened it, Sam stood there exhausted but smiling faintly. "It's done," he said. "They're both in custody. You should be proud." I wasn't sure I could be. Proud felt like the wrong word when your father was in handcuffs and your brother's career was gone. Still, I nodded. "Thank you," I whispered. He gave me a file. "They'll call you in to testify soon. Be ready. It won't be easy." "Nothing about this ever was," I said. That night, I stood by my window watching the snow bury the city in silence. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt like release. The next morning, another headline appeared. "Hero-turned criminal town of Fairbrook reckons with Carter legacy." I closed the article and stared at my reflection in the dark screen. The world finally knew who my father really was. But what they didn't know, what I barely understood myself, was that sometimes truth doesn't set you free. It just burns everything you thought you were leaving, only what can survive the fire. The trial began in early spring, the snow gone, but the chill of winter still clinging to the air. The courthouse was packed with reporters, former colleagues, and townspeople who once treated my father like royalty. Now they came to witness his fall. I sat behind the prosecution's table, heart steady, but stomach knotted, my hands folded around the small silver bracelet my mother had given me when I was 16. For strength, she'd said back then. I hadn't realized how much I'd need it. My father entered in his suit, the same one he wore to award ceremonies, the same confident stride, except this time his wrists bore faint red marks from handcuffs and his eyes were hollow. Evan followed, flanked by his lawyer. He looked younger, smaller, stripped of the arrogance that had once filled every room he walked into. Our eyes met briefly. He looked away first. The charges were read aloud: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy to defraud the state, obstruction of justice. Each word sounded like a nail sealing a coffin. When the prosecutor presented the evidence, I saw the same documents I had once hidden in my apartment projected onto a giant screen. Transaction histories, false invoices, the fake development companies, and my father's signature at the bottom of every page. When it was my turn to testify, the courtroom went still. I swore on the Bible, sat down, and tried to steady my breath. The prosecutor began gently. "Miss Carter, can you tell the court what you discovered during your time managing the Veterans Relief Fund?" I told them everything. The irregular withdrawals, my father's dismissal, the threats, the slap, the years of silence. My voice cracked only once when I mentioned the veterans who had never received their aid because of the stolen funds. "I thought loyalty meant protecting your family," I said softly. "But real loyalty means protecting what's right." My father didn't look at me while I spoke. He kept his eyes on the table, his jaw clenched, the muscles twitching like he was swallowing glass. When the defense lawyer rose, I knew what was coming. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, "isn't it true you had a strained relationship with your father, that you were dismissed from your position for insubordination?" I met his gaze. "Yes, because I refused to lie." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge silenced it with a glance. When I stepped down from the stand, I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying this truth on my shoulders for years and had finally set it down. The trial lasted 3 weeks. By the end, no one doubted the verdict. The jury found both Richard and Evan Carter guilty on all counts. The sentence came quietly, but its weight was immense. 12 years in prison for my father. 6 for my brother, both reduced to partial house arrest after appeals due to health and community service contributions. When the judge finished, Dad finally looked at me. His eyes burned with a fury so old it almost looked like grief. "You'll live with this shame forever," he said under his breath as the bailiff led him away. I shook my head. "No, Dad," I whispered. "I'll live with peace." Reporters swarmed me outside the courthouse, flashing cameras, shouting questions. "Emily, do you feel vindicated? Do you have any regrets? How does it feel to bring down your own family?" I paused at the top of the courthouse steps. "I didn't bring them down," I said quietly. "They did that themselves." Then I walked away. For weeks afterward, the town was electric with gossip and fury. People who had once defended my father now claimed they'd always suspected. Donations poured into the veterans program, this time under state supervision. The Carter house was seized and sold. My mother moved to a small cottage near the lake. When I visited her a month later, she looked fragile. Her once perfect posture slightly bent her eyes softer. "He'll never forgive you," she said quietly as we sat in the kitchen. "I know," I replied, "but that's not my burden anymore." She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. "You were right, Emily. We should have listened." It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something. I left her house that evening feeling both lighter and lonelier. Justice had come, but it didn't feel clean. It never does. It leaves ashes even when you're the one who lit the match. That night, I walked by the river near my apartment, the same place where I'd made the call to Sam months before. The air smelled of rain and thawing earth. The water moved fast, carrying bits of ice downstream. I watched it for a long time, letting the sound of it drown out the ghosts in my head. Justice had a price, but so did silence. And between the two, I'd finally chosen the one I could live with. 6 months passed before I stepped back into the town of Fairbrook. The courthouse had long since quieted, the reporters moved on, and the Carter name, once printed in gold on plaques and banners, was now whispered with discomfort. People avoided eye contact when they recognized me on Main Street, unsure whether to pity or resent me. I didn't care anymore. I wasn't there for them. I was there to close the last chapter. The Veterans Relief Office had been moved downtown to a new building, bright, simple, transparent glass instead of locked doors and wood-paneled secrecy. Sam met me there holding a cardboard box. "These are the recovered files," he said. "Every cent your father took has been accounted for. The restitution payments are coming through." Inside the box were folders labeled with veterans' names, each one a story of someone who'd been denied help. I ran my hand over them, my throat tight. "So it's really over?" I asked. Sam gave a small, sad smile. "Legally, yes. But you and I both know justice never really ends. It just changes form." I nodded. He was right. Justice isn't a victory march, it's cleanup after the storm. That evening, I drove past our old family home. The house had been sold to a young couple with 2 kids. The porch where my father slapped me now held a swing draped with fairy lights. I parked at the curb and sat for a while watching the new family through the window, laughter, the glow of a television, a dog at someone's feet. Normalcy. Something that had never existed inside those walls before. My reflection in the windshield looked older, somehow sharper. Maybe I was finally becoming the woman my father feared I'd grow into, someone he couldn't control. When I visited my mother the next day, she was sitting on the porch of her small lakeside house, knitting with trembling hands. She looked up when she saw me, her face softening into something halfway between guilt and pride. "The paper said you were offered a position on the fund's new board," she said quietly. "That's admirable." I smiled faintly. "It's not about titles, Mom. It's about making things right." She nodded. "Your father used to say that once too, before power became his god." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the gentle slap of water against the dock. "He writes to me," she said after a moment. "Every week. Always the same thing. He says he did it for us, for family." I stared out at the horizon. That's the lie he'll live with. He didn't do it for family. He did it to own us. She reached over, placing her cold hand on mine. "And what will you live with, Emily?" I thought about that question all the way home. What would I live with? The knowledge that I'd destroyed my family to save my soul? Or the quiet truth that maybe they'd destroyed themselves long before I ever spoke out? That night, I finally opened my father's last letter, the one I'd left unread since the trial. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were sharp. "You've made your point. You've won. I hope you can live with what you've done because I can't. When the name Carter dies with me, I hope you'll understand that loyalty meant something once. I folded the letter back into the envelope and burned it over my kitchen sink. Watching the flames consume the paper, I whispered to the smoke, "Loyalty means something now too, Dad. It just doesn't mean lying." The next morning, the local newspaper ran a small headline, "Carter Daughter Joins State Oversight Committee for Veterans Relief." The photo showed me standing outside the new office, hair tied back a small smile that looked tired but real. The caption read, "Emily Carter from whistleblower to reformer." I stared at the picture for a long time. It wasn't redemption. It was responsibility, and this time I intended to bear it honestly. A year later, Thanksgiving came again. The day started quiet. No calls, no guilt, no expectations. The smell of cinnamon drifted from my oven, and sunlight poured through the window of my new home in Montpelier. It wasn't grand like the old Carter house. It was modest, full of second-hand furniture and laughter from the people I chose to share my life with. My table was set for 6. Sam, 2 veterans from the new relief board, a neighbor who'd lost her husband last winter, and my mother who had finally agreed to come. When she arrived, her hair had gone completely silver. She hugged me longer than usual and whispered, "You're stronger than any of us ever were." I smiled and handed her a glass of wine. The house filled slowly with voices, clinking glasses, stories about recovery and rebuilding. Every sound felt like a small miracle proof that life could grow again from the ashes of what was broken. After dinner, as the sun dipped low, I stepped outside. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke, and for a moment I thought about last year. The slap, the door closing my father's face, twisted with rage. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It just existed like a scar that proved I'd healed. My mother joined me on the porch, pulling her shawl tighter. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. Turning him in, I took a deep breath. "I used to," I admitted. "But regret and grief look the same sometimes. What I feel now isn't regret, it's release." She nodded, eyes glistening. "He writes less now. The last letter said he finally understands why you did it." She smiled faintly. "He said he never wanted to raise a coward. For the first time in years, that memory didn't feel like poison. He was right about one thing I said quietly. Family means something. Just not what he thought." Inside, laughter erupted, Sam telling a story about a botched audit, the veterans teasing him, my mother's soft chuckle joining theirs. I stood in the doorway for a long time watching them. This was family people bound by choice, not control. People who didn't demand silence as proof of loyalty. I raised my glass toward the light, whispering a small toast to the version of myself who'd once stood in the snow face burning heartbreaking, thinking it was the end. It hadn't been the end at all. It was the beginning of everything real. Later, after everyone had left, I walked to my desk and opened a new document on my laptop. At the top, I typed "The Carter Fund for Integrity and Justice Annual Report." It was the first year we'd run it independently, the first time transparency was more than just a promise. The screen glowed softly in the dim room. I added one last line at the bottom, dedicated to those who choose truth over comfort, even when it costs them everything. Then I closed the laptop and let the silence settle. The clock on the mantel struck midnight. Thanksgiving had passed, but for me, gratitude was just beginning. I wasn't grateful for the pain or the betrayal, but for what they'd revealed. That freedom isn't found in forgiveness from others. It's found in forgiving yourself for surviving the fire and daring to start again. As I turned off the lights and climbed into bed, snow began to fall outside, gentle and endless, covering the world in quiet redemption. For the first time in my life, I slept without fear. And somewhere far away behind iron gates and cold walls, maybe my father finally understood that the daughter he tried to silence had only learned how to speak louder, clearer, and without shame. Because family doesn't end when the bloodline breaks. It begins the moment you stop mistaking obedience for love.